Now we're going to simplify rational expressions with imaginary numbers. So remember, the rule with fractions is that the denominator always must have a rational number in it. So notice what I have over to the right. I have a chart of what the first four powers of I is equal to. And remember, some of you may not know this, but most of you do. I, the imaginary I, is what represents the square root of -1. Remember, there is no square root of -1 in the real numbers. So they came up with a way to represent -1 using what's called imaginary numbers, and it's this little kind of italic I. So I to the first power just is I, and that represents the square root of -1. But when you square it, I squared, well, what would be the square root of -1 times the square root of -1? Well, the square roots would go away, and that would be -1. I cubed, well, -1, so I squared times I to the first would be -1 times I. Well, -1 times I is just -I. And then I to the fourth, well, I to the fourth is just x squared times x squared, or I squared times I squared. Well, -1 times -1 is +1. All right. So the trick is we need the i's out of the denominator. So the way to get I out of the denominator, if you square I, you get -1. So that's the first thing that we're going to do. We're going to multiply top and bottom, denominator, numerator by I. All right. Well, I times I is I squared. I squared is -1. -1 times 4 is -4. Four times, I really should have done this. Now remember, we don't like negative signs in the denominator. So what is a positive divided by negative? It's a negative. So the negative sign we pull out in front. So this is the simplified version of this original thing. Now again, remember, when there's an expression that has to be rationalized, you're going to use the conjugate method again. So the conjugate of 4 subtract 2i. Yep, 4 plus 2i. So we're going to multiply top and bottom. And then remember, the cool thing about conjugate multiplying, you just multiply the first times the first, put a subtract sign, and then multiply the second times the second. In the numerator, it just becomes a distributive problem. So let's see what we did. Yeah, so 7i times 4 is 28i. 7i times 2i is 14i squared. Remember, I squared is -1. So let's see what we did. And then 4 times 4 is 16. -2i times +2i is -4i squared. Again, I squared is -1. So let's see what we did. So that becomes 28i plus 14 times -1. And then 16 subtract I squared is -1. 4 times -1. Negative times negative is a positive. So 16 plus 4 is 20. 28i subtract is 14 times -1 is negative. Subtract 14. Well, what do all three, they all three have to have something in common. What do all three have in common? Well, they're all evens. So a 2 can be factored out. So when we divide each of those terms by 2, 28i divided by 2 is 14i. And there's a subtract sign. 14 divided by 2 is 7. 20 divided by 2 is 10. And this is the final answer on that. All right, that's it.